the Cold War. A conflict not of guns and bombs, but of ideologies, paranoia, and global domination was a battle that spanned over 4 decades, shaping the modern world in ways both visible and hidden. It was a chess match between 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each armed not just with nuclear weapons, but with opposing visions of what the world should be: capitalism versus communism. The dawn of the Cold War. The Cold War arose from the ashes of World War II, a war that had torn the world apart and left Europe in ruins. The United States emerged as a global superpower, with its capitalist economy booming and its influence stretching across the globe. The Soviet Union, having lost millions of lives to Nazi aggression, was determined never to be weak again and saw communism as the path to a stronger, more equal society. In 1945, the uneasy alliance between the US and the Soviet Union began to unravel. Europe became the first battleground of influence. The Americans and their allies promoted democracy and free markets, while the Soviets sought to expand communism across Eastern Europe. As Stalin's Red Army marched westward, Eastern Europe fell under the shadow of the Soviet sphere. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill famously declared, had descended across the continent. The ideological divide. The Cold War was, at its heart, a war of ideas. Capitalism, with its promises of individual freedom and economic opportunity, versus communism, which sought to create a classless society where wealth was shared equally. To the US, the spread of communism was seen as a direct threat to the principles of democracy. For the Soviets, capitalism was an exploitative system designed to enrich the wealthy few while keeping the working class in chains. America portrayed itself as the champion of freedom, but the darker side of this was the willingness to support brutal dictators and suppress democratic movements whenever they aligned with communist interests. The US was just as ruthless as the Soviets in this ideological battle. In Latin America, Africa, and Asia, capitalist powers backed military coups and oppressive regimes, caring little for human rights as long as they could prevent the red tide from spreading. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, glorified itself as the protector of the working class, but it too crushed dissent with an iron fist, as seen in the Hungarian uprising of 1956 and Prague Spring of 1968, where Soviet tanks rolled in to silence cries for freedom. Nuclear terror and paranoia. The Cold War was fought not on traditional battlefields, but in the shadows through espionage, diplomacy, and most terrifyingly, nuclear brinkmanship. The development of nuclear weapons cast a shadow of terror over the world. Mutually assured destruction, or MAD, became the doctrine of the day, where both the US and the Soviet Union knew that a full-scale nuclear war would result in the annihilation of both nations and likely the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of that nightmare. When the US discovered Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from its shores, the world held its breath. For 13 days, the planet teetered on the edge of nuclear destruction. It was only through careful negotiation between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev that catastrophe was avoided. But the crisis cemented a haunting reality: at any moment, the Cold War could become hot and civilization could be reduced to ashes. Proxy wars, battlegrounds of ideology. Though the Cold War was cold in terms of direct conflict between the superpowers, it was far from bloodless. Across the globe, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in proxy wars, where they armed, funded, and supported opposing sides in local conflicts. In Korea, from 1950 to 1953, and Vietnam, from 1955 to 1975, American soldiers fought and died to stop the spread of communism. Vietnam became a stain on the American conscience, a brutal, bloody conflict where millions of Vietnamese civilians and over 580,000 American soldiers perished. Despite the overwhelming military might of the United States, the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, supported by the Soviet Union and China, ultimately led to a communist victory. It was a humbling moment for America, showing that its vast military power could not always guarantee success. In Afghanistan, the roles were reversed. The Soviets invaded in 1979, hoping to prop up a communist regime in the face of an Islamic insurgency. But the United States, eager to repay the Soviets for Vietnam, funneled money, weapons, and training to the Mujahideen fighters, including future Taliban and Osama bin Laden. What began as a Soviet war turned into a quagmire, a decade-long conflict that drained Soviet resources and morale, contributing to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. The space race to the stars and beyond. Not all Cold War battles were fought on Earth. The space race became a symbolic struggle for technological and ideological supremacy. The Soviets struck first, launching Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth, and following that with Yuri Gagarin, the first human to journey into space in 1961. The United States responded with its own ambitions. In 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon, a triumphant achievement that marked the height of American innovation. The moon landing was not just a scientific milestone, but a clear message that capitalism, not communism, would lead humanity into the future. Economic strains and the collapse of the Soviet Union. For decades, the Soviet Union projected an image of strength, but by the 1980s, the cracks in its foundation were growing impossible to ignore. The centralized economy of the Soviet system, while formidable in its ability to mobilize resources, was stagnant, inefficient, and riddled with corruption. The capitalist United States economy, while deeply flawed and exploitative in its own ways, flourished with innovation and consumer culture. As the arms race drained Soviet resources, the living conditions of the average Soviet citizen worsened. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev took power, realizing that reform was necessary if the Soviet Union was to survive. His policies of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring, aimed to modernize the economy and provide more political freedoms. But these changes came too late. The Soviet Union, already weakened by the war in Afghanistan and internal dissent, was unraveling. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was the most visible sign that the Cold War was nearing its end. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, marking the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. The Cold War's legacy, the shadows we live in. Though the Cold War officially ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, its legacy remains deeply ingrained in global politics. The arms race left the world with thousands of nuclear weapons still poised to strike. The proxy wars scarred nations, from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan, leaving wounds that have yet to fully heal. And the ideological battle, while less overt, continues to play out in the conflicts between capitalism and socialism, authoritarianism and democracy, rich and poor. America, for all its claims of championing freedom, revealed the darker side of capitalism, a system willing to support tyrants, exploit resources, and fuel wars to maintain dominance. The Soviet Union, despite its promises of equality, showed that communism could be as repressive and corrupt as the capitalism it sought to destroy. In the end, the Cold War was not a victory for anyone. It was a period of fear, paranoia, and destruction. It exposed the lengths to which nations will go to protect their interests, even at the expense of millions of lives. America, in its pursuit of global capitalism, has proven time and again that it will stop at nothing to secure its place at the top, whether through war, economic domination, or political interference. The Cold War may have ended, but its ghost still haunts us. The divide between rich and poor, the thirst for power, and the exploitation of the vulnerable, all these elements remain with us today. In a world driven by profit and competition, the question is not whether another Cold War will happen, but whether humanity will ever break free from its cycle of greed and destruction.